In today's video, I'll be breaking down how I made this really cool space scene. The assets from this video were kindly provided by CG Trader, who are the sponsor of today's video. I'll be talking more about that as I go. And also a quick note before we start, the project files from this video will be available on my Patreon, so if you'd like to download them and have a play yourself, you can grab them on there. The first stage of the process after working out what I wanted the shots to be was to start preparing the assets. I imported them all into Blender, tweaked some of the shaders if needed. As I mentioned, all of these assets are from CG Trader, and I grabbed a load of stuff to make setting up this space scene a lot easier. In total, I downloaded an asteroid pack, a planet pack, the spaceship interior, as well as the exterior spaceship, which are actually two different models, the model of the character, and then I also downloaded a kit-bashed kit of sci-fi parts, which I used to populate the background of the cockpit in the reverse shots. To make the final shot, which is the space environment, I started by bringing in the model of the planet. This particular one has some really nice 8K textures which hold up great at this level of detail. You can obviously use different planet assets, or you can even make your own. After this, I added a sun lamp, which will be the main light source for the scene. One key thing to do for a space scene is to turn off all environmental lighting. Blender's default setting for this is a dark grey colour, which introduces a lot of bounce light. Then to create the asteroid belt, I created a circle, which would be the basis of the geometry. Then imported the asteroid pack that I downloaded. The current level of detail is really good, which is great for the ones that I used close to camera, but if I create thousands of instances of this, it will probably crash my computer. So I decimated the ones being used on the asteroid belt to make them lower poly. Then I put them all into a collection and used that collection in a very simple geometry node setup to scatter them across the circle that I'd created. Inside of the geometry node setup, I added a random value node, which I plugged into the scale and rotation, and then I can use this to add some variety for their positions and their size. I then placed some of the high poly asteroids closer to camera to give the foreground and midground a little bit of detail and parallax. Next, I brought in the spaceship model. I was very lazy with the materials because I knew it would be very contrasty, so I just made two different metal materials and assigned them to different parts of the ship. Once the shaders were set up, I animated it doing a simple fly past the camera, and then animated my 3D camera to pan with it. To top it off, I added a couple of extra lights to cheat the lighting slightly. I parented a small area light onto the back of the spaceship, illuminating some of the details. I kept it quite weak so it wasn't lighting up the scene too much. It helped making the back of the ship less of a total silhouette, introducing a small amount of detail which makes it more visually interesting. Then I rendered out the scene and the spaceship separately in two different render passes, as well as a utility pass with cryptomats for the background, and then set about compositing the scene. I started with some of the fun stuff like adding small glows onto the engines. It's really easy to overdo this, so I always find myself turning it down a little bit after I set it up initially. Generally with compositing glows, less is more, and you don't really want to notice it, it should just be more of a feel thing. I did the same thing to the planet's surface, just a very soft glow. It's mimicking a little bit of atmosphere and faking some halation coming off of the hot highlights on the planet's surface and also the sunlight on the asteroids. Then I created the star field using Nuke's 3D system. You could definitely do this in Blender, and it's exactly the same technique of just using a noise texture and crunching it up. The reason I do it in Nuke is so that I have more of a real-time control over it, as opposed to baking it into the 3D renders from Blender. So here I'm creating an 8K noise texture, and then using a grade node to crunch up the black and the white points until the noise is condensed down to just very small specks. Once that's done, I apply it as a texture to a very large UV sphere that encompasses my entire scene. And I'm using the camera from Blender that I exported as an alembic and brought it into Nuke, and rendering the star field through that with motion blur. Next, I created the source of light, which is the sun in the shot. For the center of the sun, I created a very simple rotor shape that I colored slightly yellow, and then added an exponential glow onto this, which gives it that blooming effect. This is projected on a card in 3D space, and again filmed through the 3D camera, so it moves correctly with the scene with the right amount of parallax. Once the base look of the sun was set up, I began creating a glint and a lens flare coming off of it, which really sells the shot. I put an axis in 3D space at the location where the sun is, and then used a reconcile 3D node which is plugged into the camera and the axis that I created, and this creates a position in 2D using X and Y coordinates for where the sun is in 3D space looking through the camera. From here I can expression link this to a flare node and use that as the origin of the lens flare, and then as the sun moves through the shot, the lens flare will react accordingly. Once one was set up, I then duplicated it and began changing the shape of the lens flare to build it up. I started by creating a few spike balls at different sizes to create some variation, then a couple of chromatic rings. These are offset from the sun slightly to create some interesting movement, a nice blue anamorphic lens flare line going through the center of the sun, and then a few irisy shapes coming off the sun towards the edge of the frame. When all of these different elements of the lens flare are combined, it really changes the shot from feeling like a very CG space scene to something a lot more optical that was filmed through a real camera. I also grabbed a few nebula looking textures from Production Crate and used these to mix into the background to make the starfield look a bit more interesting. On its own, the black and white background feels a little bit sparse, and so by projecting these textures on some geometry in 3D space and integrating them into my background, it adds some subtle colour and interest into the background of the shot. For some finishing touches, I added some extra lens flares coming off of the hot highlights of the engines. This is done by keying the highlights and pre-molting them to isolate them. And then after that I blur them horizontally by lots of different increments, starting at 5 and doubling each time, until about 300 or 400. Then if you plus all of these together and then plus them back on top of your shot, and turn the mix down nice and low, you get these really nice streaky lens flares that interact with your shot and the highlights as it moves. On top of this, I added some lens distortion, again to make the shot feel more optical. I rendered with 15% overscan from Blender, so I had some extra headroom at the edges of the frame to warp inwards using the lens distortion. As well as this, I added some softness into the corners of the frame, using a radial and shuffling it into the depth channel, and then using a Z defocus with the point set to the center of the frame, which softens the edges and creates the correct amount of fall off. I also added some chromatic aberration, again introducing some lens artifacts, and finally a lens dirt element. To make this interact with the lighting in my shot, I blur the footage by about 200 pixels and then multiply this over the lens dirt element. This means you'll only see the lens dirt when bright elements of the shot are passing behind it. This is also overlaid on top of the shot, and that's the final step before the shot is finished. After that, I brought it into DaVinci Resolve and added a color grade. Most of the look comes from making the color temperature a bit cooler, introducing a little bit of contrast, and adding a Kodak 2383 film look with a plugin called Dehancer, as well as some 16mm film grain to give it some life. And that's how I made the main shot. The rest of the sequence in the interior of the spaceship is pretty straightforward. I set up the asset for the cockpit and the astronaut with the rig. Then to create the hyperspace tunnel effect out the windows, I created a large cylinder outside of the spaceship and animated several instances of noise textures along it. To get the procedural lines, I stretched the noise texture massively in one axis, then animated its position in the mapping node in the shader to control the speed and the amount of movement. Then on top of this, I multiplied and screened multiple other noise textures, also moving at a similar rate at different scales to create the diversity. This is plugged into an emission shader, and it's in a collection set to indirect only, so you don't see it out the windows, but it's the main source of lighting in the shot. For the version that you actually see in the final comps, I made a slightly more refined version in Nuke, again to give me more flexibility, the same as the Starfield, so I could tweak it without having to re-render. You can see me setting this up here in Nuke. The same as the Blender shader, I'm using a few different noise textures that are stretched out to create the procedural lines. This is being mapped onto a cylinder in 3D space, and again I'm rendering this through the camera from Blender that's exported as an alembic and then brought into Nuke. The main reason for doing this in Nuke over Blender, as well as giving me more flexibility to change it in real time, was that I wanted to blur some of the lines to create less of a streaky look. Unless I'm missing something, there's not actually a way to blur textures in Blender's shader editor, which is something I think would be a really welcome addition. So to get the multi-layered look of the hyperspace, as well as some of the really streaky, sharp lines, I blurred some of the noise textures to create some interesting gradients moving through it as well. And when all of these are layered on top of each other, it creates much more of a complicated texture that looks more interesting. This is then layered underneath the render of the cockpit with the transparent windows, and I can put those noise textures on the 3D cylinder in the background, and then add a ridiculous amount of glow on top to make it all look nice. That gave me the majority of the look straight away, and then I added a couple of other small area lights into the scene, just to highlight parts of the shot that I wanted to exaggerate. For example, I added a small light on the dashboard to make some of the features pop out a bit more, as well as a top light from behind the astronaut to make the helmet a bit brighter. I can also control this with cryptomats in compositing if I want to, but I always prefer to try and get it as good as I can in Blender first with the real 3D lights, and then just pull things around a little bit if needed in Nuke. The elements you see on the screens were just some production craze assets that I got of sci-fi HUDs. I brought these into Nuke and added some simple animation onto them to make a couple of them spin, and changing the color to sync up with the alarm sound that goes off. And then I put these onto the screens in Blender as animated image textures, with a few surface imperfection textures of fingerprints and scratches that I plugged into the roughness and the normal maps. This makes the screens look nice and grubby to fit the aesthetic of the spaceship. And that's really all there was to it. Once the scene was set up, I just created the different animations in the different shots to make the astronaut do a few basic movements like pulling the throttle and leaning forward to check the screen. I'm not a very good animator, so I kept this fairly minimal. So to finish off, here is the scene one more time. A massive thank you to CG Trader for sponsoring this video as well as providing the assets. Again, check out my Patreon if you're interested in grabbing the project files or mucking about with the CG renders yourself. Thank you very much for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.